Metal Gear Solid V has one of the most misunderstood plots in all of video games. There are as many theories and ideas as to what Metal Gear Solid V's overall meaning is and what the truth really is as there are players. And it seems no one person has a singular, solid, satisfying explanation for most of what we see throughout these games. And to be clear, when I say Metal Gear Solid V, I mean both Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain. And for many purposes in this video, we might as well include Peace Walker, although that game formally lacks the V subtitle. But go with me here, peace symbols have an inverted V in them, and the V symbol made with index and middle fingers is used by plenty of characters in Peace Walker. Could it have been a stealth V game? Could Kojima's plans for V have included Peace Walker and indeed originated around that game's making? One of the oldest and most common games of Magic is colloquially known as the Cups, or also called a shell game. It typically involves the magician presenting the audience with 2 or 3 cups and 1 or 2 balls, which are then hidden under the cups. Then the magician moves the cups and will seemingly make the ball instantaneously travel from one place to another, say from his hand to under a cup, or from one cup to the other. He may even begin by presenting you with only 2 cups and 1 ball, and end the show with 3 cups and 3 or more entirely new balls. In Metal Gear Solid V, we are having a shell game played in front of us, and we don't even really see the game properly for what it is because of who's playing the magician, Major Zero, Cypher himself. Skullface mentions in the infamous Jeep scene that Zero sought a system of control, which on the surface refers to the Lali Lule Lo, the Patriot system that was in its early stages at that time. And Skullface is here trying to get at the ball, really Big Boss, under the cups that Zero is moving around the table, and we play as one of the fake balls. We're not just hidden under a cup, though. The audience knows we're not the original, and we're just part of the trick that's shown in the open and meant to be understood easily as a setup for further deception. Venom himself stands for the audience, and so Zero's system of controlling Venom is represented on a formal level by the game itself. The game series is indeed already intricately tied in with the Hollywood system of filmmaking, and so V uses this Hollywood system against the player. Zero has mentally programmed Venom in a certain way, and he doesn't really realize it at first. Our attention has to be drawn to the trick's existence before we can even begin to comprehend what a master of sleight of hand can accomplish, and Zero's no slouch. In a very literal sense, Kojima's directorial hand in the game serves as an overarching shadow to Zero's own hand in the plot of V. And indeed, in Hollywood, when there's a film with big money, there's big promotions to go with it. Metal Gear Solid V had a very ambitious marketing campaign, and if indeed the form of the game is structured to trick us into believing a certain interpretation of the game, then it stands to reason this trick could, and likely would, extend to the PR campaign for the game itself. The box art, what the staff and trailers told us in promotional materials, the released extra material outside of the game, all of this content should be treated as possibly in on the trick, but also as a potential source for finding some answers. The game's plot is structured in a way to preserve this trick's very existence, and to ruin that in the trailers would be counterintuitive, so it stands to reason if the game is fooling us, then so was the rest of Konami. Would Hitchcock have spoiled Psycho in his publicity tour? In fact, the PR campaign for Psycho included pleas for viewers to preserve that film's twist regarding the killer. And we should question more than just the PR for this game. What about all that cut material? They didn't have to tell us about all of that, did they? What if some of it, or perhaps even most of it, wasn't truly cut from the game, but instead is there to serve as yet another layer of distractions and facade in order to fool the audience of this game into believing a certain interpretation, or perhaps giving them reason to think some interpretations are wrong, false, or maybe even not think of certain interpretations at all? Big Brother is a big theme of this game, and we should act as detectives when playing, suspect of the very world around us in our hunt for what's really going on. As we know, 2 plus 2 equals 5 here. We have to learn to doublethink, really, to see past this game's surface level and begin to uncover the real truth underneath. There are double meanings all over this game, and anytime one pops up, you should always stop and see if it's really just a double meaning, and not perhaps part of a more complicated scheme. After all, one of the recurring themes of Metal Gear Solid is turtles all the way down, and this game is no exception to that. The real big brother of Metal Gear Solid V is Zero, the man behind the curtain. Our investigation should be focused on determining just all of what the Spy Master of Spy Masters was really up to with these games' plots. The game is sneakily structured in the way it is to at first hide the truth from us in an obvious manner, then make us think we have the truth via a decoy we have to work to see, but hiding beneath that, if we keep looking, is yet another truth, which is what I intend to start to uncover here. But allow me to say, before I get into this, that some of what I'm about to lay out may seem controversial or contradictory, or perhaps that I'm just misinformed. Just trust me and go along with what I'm saying, because it's a large canvas and it takes a while to start to paint the whole picture of what's going on. I just ask your patience while I try to properly expand on everything that needs expanding on before I move on to another subject. With all that said, this is in the end just one interpretation of this game and isn't intended to be a comprehensive final word on the matter, as I believe the game is like any good work of art. It's something that can continue to have truths flow out of it if you can continue to vary your perspective on it and keep an open mind during the process. What I intend for my process as to what follows is to analyze the filmmaking aspects of the scenes and the game format itself presented to us in Metal Gear Solid V, break all that down, and compare all that with the intel we have inside the game itself and our own meta intel about the game's making and what we've learned about it now these 5 years after its release. I've loved this game since I first played it, but there was a time after first beating it where I was left wondering if I really got all there was to get from V. Now, after uncovering what I'm about to lay out to you here, I feel like my admiration and love for this game has been reignited, and I hope I can pass some of that fire on to you here with how I interpret this game. Now, to get things really started, let's think back to the cups. In Metal Gear Solid V, we are presented at first with one ball, the real one, Big Boss, really in Peace Walker, but more are then added to the trick before its finale. There are 3 balls at play here. There's one original and 2 copies on the board being moved around, but we're only ever presented with 1 or 2 at a time during the entire trick. Now, Skullface for some reason wants to kill Big Boss, and Zero's left with the task of hiding him. It's my thinking that Zero more than likely set up Skullface to be killed at Camp Omega by Big Boss in 75, but the plan went wrong for reasons I'll get into later. Instead of that happening, Skullface left just as Big Boss scaled the cliff face like ships passing in the night. After Big Boss is knocked out, Zero is left to react to this event, so he enacts this shell game for Skullface and really the world in order to hide the real Big Boss away from the eyes of everyone. The only shells, or possible decoys, Zero had available needed to be people who could be moved from the spot we see Big Boss, the chopper crash, to the next spot, the hospital in Dekelia, Cyprus. So, what if he moved 2 fake balls and secreted the original off the table at this point? Now, I understand most people who have beaten the game believe Venom to be the medic. If you do believe this, I'm going to ask you right now to temporarily, in good faith, suspend your belief of that idea and open up to some new possibilities. Remember, this game lies to you on purpose to get you to believe a decoy truth, and the idea that Venom is the medic is one of those decoy truths. I'll explain everything, so just keep an open mind and go with me here. One fake Big Boss we know of is the medic. Now, the medic himself represents the character of Player 2 in Peace Walker's co-op story mode, which itself was a first-time feature for the franchise. The medic goes along with Big Boss on every mission from start to finish of Peace Walker, and it stands to reason this is the medic that was in the chopper at Ground Zero. Now, there were other occupants of the chopper as well. Morpho had a pilot, who was unknown, and Kazuhira was there in the compartment. There was also Chico, who was rescued from Camp Omega, and as Morpho evacuated Kaz from the nearly destroyed base, one more MSF soldier probably made it on board the chopper before the base went under. The only ones of these that really have an identity on this chopper now are Big Boss, Kaz, Paz, Chico, and the medic. These are our suspects for the possible Big Boss shells. We know the medic would have been standing next to Big Boss as the memories we see of the event show in V, but we have to remember these are Hollywood-made representations of memories and are not the actual events. The scenes we watch aren't the record itself and instead serve as a kind of representation of the subject's own memory of the event. And if that person was in the event and suffered trauma, it stands to reason their narration could easily be unreliable. We must assume the narrator, even the camera of V, is unreliable in this sense. The game format is being used against Venom, and in this scene's case, likely straight up lying to us. And we already know this is something the game does. Look at the pause hallucination the player experiences at the tail end of the Phantom Pain. There are conversations you can overhear the soldiers on Mother Base have during this entire episode about how Big Boss keeps going to this empty platform under construction and talking to no one for minutes, even hours on end. The entire structure and scene with pause are not real. We, the player, are suffering from the same delusions and seeing the same illusions that result from Venom Snake's brain damage and mental programming and past trauma. You can see one of these examples in the first moments of the Phantom Pain. As Venom opens his eyes, a nurse changes out an invisible IV bag over the bed to the right, before changing out the visible IV bag to our left. So, back to the shells in Morpho. We know Paz is out of the equation, as are the real Big Boss and Kazuhira. The only two left are Chico and the medic. The medic, then, must be Ishmael. Reanalyze the hospital section of the Phantom Pain. Are you to believe that Ishmael is an illusion the entire time, and you're really the only one there? Instead, believe your eyes here. Ishmael and Ahab are two different people. Ishmael sounds different from Big Boss because he isn't the real Big Boss. He's the medic. Kiefer Sutherland is voicing a new character in the series. Konami didn't just leave David Hayter out for no reason. This is most likely the big secret Kiefer referred to in one IGN interview. In fact, it's probably Ishmael wearing a Rykov-style Big Boss mask that we see at the end of the Truth mission, meeting Ocelot at the bridge after Ahab is secured. Ocelot gives Ishmael a real Cuban cigar, something only the real Ocelot could procure at that time, and sends this replica of Big Boss off on a replica motorcycle, just like the real one rode back in Central America. But how can we tell the difference? Well, his voice is different, but also notice the direction of the scene, especially where the camera is whenever Ishmael speaks. He says 3 lines here. The first one has a voiceover atop an out-of-context scene which is faded in over the shot of the two characters. As that out-of-context shot fades out, Ishmael delivers his second line, still off-screen. The third line is then delivered with him finally in frame, but his back is turned to the camera. We never see his face move as he speaks. This was, I believe, a very deliberate, careful choice in direction by Kojima as a way of hinting at this truth in the truth. More than likely, Ishmael started serving as Big Boss's body double as soon as he woke up, which was probably sometime before Ahab came to. Ocelot, the hospital staff, even Zero himself all treat this double as if he's the real thing, because that's the game. They're fooling Skullface and really the entire world. They've sold the world on the story that Ishmael is Big Boss, and part of that whole scheme is Ahab being an obvious double sitting right next to him. By treating the obvious double in that way, Zero is able to provide contrast to the legit treatment he and the rest of his operation give to Ishmael. So if the medic is Ishmael, that means Ahab must be the other person left in Morpho at Ground Zero, Chico. As we ourselves are Venom, then our identity as a mentally programmed double of a double should probably not be easy to uncover. But functionally, it wouldn't serve to have this mental copy to go on believing they were the real Big Boss. So this programming has to be built in layers. As the initial illusion is dispelled, another is ready to take its place, eventually leaving the decoy with full knowledge of who they are and how they got there. Eventually, the mental copy has to realize they're a copy, and part of that is also knowing who the real Big Boss is and who isn't, and possibly who else is standing in as a double, all in order to keep maintaining the cover operation. Chico needs to remember who he is, just as Ocelot needs to remember who the real Big Boss is once the time is right. Let's take a close look at Chico and ask ourselves, would Chico see things the way we're presented them in Metal Gear Solid V? Does it make sense that he is Venom? Now, the strongest evidence is the awakening of Venom. When he comes to, one of the last things Venom is shown by the Doctor are a pair of pictures of the old MSF crew of Morpho, Kaz, the pilot, Big Boss, and Medic. Now, this photo is signed on the back in the Truth mission as being from Vic Boss. Now, that's almost certainly Ishmael. Venom is now being asked to give Vic Boss cover all for the real Big Boss. This sequence of events has happened to Chico before, in fact, during Peace Walker. Chico is captured, gives up information on his compass, and is being held in a small village by the enemy when Snake infiltrates the scene and comes in to find Chico. A very crucial scene for Chico's character then plays out as Chico eventually confesses to Snake that he's given up his comrades, and Snake responds by giving him a rousing speech, calling Chico an hombre nuevo, and asking Chico to now give his new life to Snake. Earlier in this scene, Snake was still posing under his cover identity as a photographer and had given Chico some photos of his comrades before going into his speech. So there's the photos, becoming a new man, and then being asked to give your life to a greater cause. Venom's and Chico's reawakenings are the same. There's also the issue of Skullface's apparent influence on the character of Venom, as evidenced by how Venom doesn't shoot Skullface when he has the opportunity in OKB-0 before Mantis appears and Skullface turns around. If we analyze this scene further, we can see several tells that show us Skullface knows Venom is Chico, and he's using their history against him. Look at how the camera snaps and locks onto Skullface's visage as he begins to deliver his speech on the helipad. His gaze is in total control of the game's camera at this moment. We are frozen in terror, unable to move or act beyond watching the scene play out in front of us. Skullface even uses the word torture before this shot, and if you look close, you can see Venom has a visible reaction to the word's utterance. Chico is probably suffering a recurrence of his trauma from when Skullface tortured him before, and this explains this whole section's weird format. We are more or less under Skullface's influence here at the end of this mission, and we probably have been this whole time in some way, thus one reason we needed mental programming to forget who we are. Consider that Skullface is using doublespeak when he talks to Venom at the end. In a way, he's doubling up Chico's history with Naked Snakes. He'll make you, the audience, believe that he's speaking of the real Big Boss's past, but in fact, he's referring in every case to something else through doublespeak. This missing knowledge explains a lot about why this scene takes place the way it does and seems so lacking in context. The true purpose of this scene is that Skullface is attempting to turn Chico to work for him against Cypher. Skullface knows Chico's been made a double and sent after him, and this is why Skullface toys with Venom so much during the Phantom Pain. He's just trying to get a chance to see the man behind the curtain. To Skullface, killing Venom would be wasting an opportunity to manipulate the situation to his advantage. What he doesn't realize is that Zero's plan was simply to use Chico to get close to Skullface, and then let Eli get close enough to take control of Psycho Mantis and Sahelanthropus, ending in Skullface getting crushed and burned. Consider the entire pause scenario. Does it make sense that the medic would hallucinate pause as an analog for their own awakening to the realization of what's really going on? Or does it make more sense that Chico would conjure up this allegorical illusion? Chico was the only soldier at MSF, medic included, that felt strongly enough to go and rescue Paz on his own. It makes sense to me that the whole Paz thing points towards Venom being Chico more than anyone else we've met in these games. The hospital section in Cyprus also holds some clues as to Venom's true identity. When you first leave the room with Ishmael, if you stop Venom and listen to his breathing, you might notice something odd. His breathing changes pitch between breaths at times. I usually hear one Kiefer breath, then a Chico breath second when the audio cue plays. Listen closely. Does it sound like the breathing of an older, veteran mercenary? Or does it sound like the breathing of a younger, scared man in his 20s who just had some procedure done to change his voice and it hasn't taken full effect yet? The idea that Chico was cut with a single line delivered by Miller in a tape seems anomalous, not to mention the fact that no one else in that helicopter died. If you go behind the scenes, there is a director interview with Kojima explaining the process for crafting the young Chico's face used in Ground Zeroes. He says they used multiple faces, blended all of those together, and then had one person come in and motion capture for the animations. The direct quote is, "That was quite challenging. Why all the effort for one character that only apparently appears in Ground Zeroes?" Have a close look at Venom's eye. We know Volgin gets a good look at his eye before fizzling out, as if he had finally realized Venom was not the real Big Boss. What about Venom's eye could be a hint towards his identity? Well, there's green in his eye. It's not super noticeable, but if you put Venom in a good, well-lit spot and zoom in, you might be able to see it. Go take a screenshot yourself and use a color dropper if you don't believe me. Remember, Ishmael has blue eyes, just like the real Big Boss. Chico has green eyes. If Chico had some kind of surgery or genetic therapy to change his eye color, perhaps they couldn't get rid of all the green. It is true that blue eyes are a recessive trait to the dominant brown allele, but when a recessive green eye allele is present along a recessive blue, the green is always expressed. It could have been difficult to get rid of the green in Chico's eyes if they tried to turn them bluer. And consider D-Horse. Chico was very upset when the boss's horse met its end in Peace Walker, as I'm sure all who played that game were, but Chico was the one in the game reacting to it. It makes sense if an operation was being put in place to not only help Chico get over his past traumas, but also emulate the real Big Boss in as many ways as possible, then giving him a white horse is a no-brainer. The novel Moby Dick is itself about Ahab, the captain of the Pequod, but the story is narrated by Ishmael, the surviving first mate of the ship. In V, Ishmael is in a way this invisible narrator, the man behind the curtain in every scene. There is an invisible presence. More than likely, Ishmael is the one running Venom's entire operation as a proxy for Zero and Big Boss, as he also stands in as another Big Boss body double. Just another layer of the illusion meant to never be seen by the audience at large, for now at least. He's probably who Skullface is really after, and thus he has to stay behind the scenes for the duration of the Phantom Pain. Considering all this evidence is one thing, but let's also go back to the scene of the crime, to Ground Zero, in the chopper Morpho right as the bomb went off. Now, what really happened there? We see several different versions of the scene in both Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain, and we're left wondering if any one of them is really the true scene. Considering that Chico is the character through which we're viewing this event and the trauma Chico suffered in that event, it makes sense that remembering the scene accurately would be difficult, if not impossible. But if you'll go with me, one of my favorite movies is 12 Angry Men, and I'm going to do something the jurors of that film do. I'm going to lay out the room and reenact this event as best I can from what evidence we have. Before we get started, let me mention something on the subject of Ground Zeroes itself. Since we're in a reconstruction right now, I guess it's a good time to say it. Metal Gear Solid V Ground Zeroes, the game we play, is not the real Big Boss's version of events. We know the voice has changed. So this is probably a reconstruction or virtual mission built for the purposes of Chico's therapy, and possibly also to have Ishmael and Ahab learn the mission for training and historical purposes. There are other indicators, such as the Fox engine glitch in one of the side ops, but just go with me for now if you doubt it. Ground Zeroes, the game, is probably a Cypher-made remake of the actual events, likely developed for the purposes of Venom's training and therapy. I only mention that Ground Zeroes is a reconstruction now because I'm about to tell you some of the stuff the game showed you was a lie. It wasn't a bald-faced 100% pants on fire lie. It's more subtle, like showing us false versions of events, which we also see in the Phantom Pain, but there it's in a context where we understand it's all a hallucination. I'm trying to say that Ground Zeroes should also perhaps be treated with this same it's a hallucination context added on top of everything we see and do in that game. Alright, so let's get started. We want to reenact the moment of the explosion in order to best figure out who would have been where, and then see what all that shows us. So first let's cue up the game footage. This is the first version of the scene we see during the ending of Ground Zeroes, and for our purposes, I'll call it version 1. You can see here, Chico stays off his feet, back on the bench here when the bomb's going off. Kaz is in front of him, Medic is next to Big Boss, and in front of Kaz a bit, and Boss is furthest off on the right, facing Paz, who's at the door. Now we can assume she does jump out, and the bomb does indeed go off. But notice how Medic is mostly obscured by Boss in most of the frames here. Now remember, Kojima is using his direction of the game camera to show and hide things very purposefully. So someone being blocked out by another character could indeed have a strong meta meaning we need to pay attention to. Now let's pause here for a second. We can see right before the bomb goes off, Big Boss is moving towards the door, and Medic you can barely see over there on his left, both holding Big Boss back and reaching his left hand out towards Paz. Now, this might indicate that Medic lost his left hand, correct? Well, maybe, maybe not. Maybe that wasn't the Medic, and he's standing in for someone else. After all, we don't see his face or really any distinguishing features here at the critical moment. This frame could be any two schmucks in a chopper. So let's go back a little bit to when Paz wakes up. Our trauma might be blocking the exact chain of events somehow. Look at where everyone is positioned before Paz wakes up. Paz is laid out here, on the bench, with her head closest to the doors. Chico's on the other side of the bench, near her head, and Boss is standing at the rear. Medic is closest to the cockpit up in the front, on the side of Paz's legs. Kaz is in front of the Medic, standing over Paz. Now, remember this setup. I think it's kind of weird, but we'll get back to it shortly. Let's play it out for now and see what it shows us. Paz wakes up and immediately goes towards Boss, and then Chico starts to move down the bench towards them. Medic jumps in to pull Kaz back as Kaz begins to approach Paz threateningly, and Medic kind of sits down here with Kaz in front of Chico's side of the bench. Now, once Paz opens the door, the order of the crew looking at her from the back of the chopper to the front are Boss, Medic, Kaz, and Chico once again. So we're to believe Chico stayed on the bench here, and it was Medic and Boss jumping towards her as she dove out the door. But this is just one version of events. Another version, we'll call number 2, revealed during the Paz illusions in the Phantom Pain, shows this same scene in slightly different lighting, and the Medic now has a balaclava on, as was typical of MSF soldiers during Peace Walker. But even in that one, we still see Chico on this bench with Kaz next to him. Medic is moved a little further back towards the opposite wall, while Boss is mostly in the same spot as is Paz. The one reconstruction that most interests me is the one Venom hallucinates in the fake infirmary with the fake Paz, which I'll call number 3. This third reconstruction with a hallucination of Paz shows her pulling her own bomb out of her torso, holding it up, then falling back onto the bed and letting the bomb fall after her. Venom then reenacts what we see Big Boss do in versions 1 and 2 of the scene, putting his hands out after Paz. But Big Boss never puts his hands out to save Paz in any version of the scene. That was the Medic. And it wasn't his right hand, it was just his left. Well, what's going on here then? Let's go back a bit more. Back to version 1. Before the chopper arrives at MSF's base under attack, but after Paz has her first bomb removed, Chico is shown on the floor of the chopper next to her. If you pay attention, you can see Chico is clearly right next to the door Big Boss is firing out from. But at a certain point, right here, all of a sudden, Chico appears back on the bench, on the other side, tending to this random soldier who's been evacuated. Did the Medic set him there? You really should ask yourself if this is something Chico would do. Did our magician just make a swap while we were looking the other way? What Chico is doing here seems like something the Medic would be doing, no? Why would the Medic still be standing over Paz while wounded MSF are coming on board? Shouldn't Chico be watching Paz while Medic tends to this other soldier? Perhaps their places have been swapped or mirrored for this part. And then notice when Medic pulls Kaz back, how he and Chico end up almost on top of one another. Perhaps Chico was on the floor before this, behind Kaz once he was brought on board, and then Medic, on the other side of the bench where we think Chico was sitting, pulled Kaz back to this location. Chico is shown here blocked out by the Medic. Then, of course, we see Paz back to the door while we're supposed to believe Medic crosses around Kaz in front of Boss, then dives towards the door after Paz right as the bomb goes off. I think we've had a swap pulled on us here. But why is it shown in this way? Well, have you heard of mirror therapy? When a patient has lost a limb or part of one, but retains the mirrored limb on their other side, there's a way to block out vision of the lost limb and replace it with a mirror image of the other full limb via a literal box and mirrors. A person with no left hand could place their hand in one of these boxes and see their right mirrored as their left. And this enables a certain type of therapy where sensations felt on the right hand are then transferred to the missing left hand via tricking the brain into sending the right hand signals to the left hand processing area in the brain. And this can, for some patients, completely cure phantom pain syndrome. This is what we're seeing here. Chico has lost his left arm because he's put it out of the chopper to save Paz. He's the only one it makes sense would do that. Medic would be concerned about saving Big Boss, sure, and probably was pulling him back similar to how he just pulled Kaz back, from behind, as he was kind of doing in version 2, grabbing Boss around his waist where it would be faster to get to, as opposed to crossing around Kaz to get in front of Boss. There was time and space enough for Chico maybe to throw himself from this bench toward Paz as she was leaving the cabin herself, or more likely, he was on the floor this entire time next to the door. Notice how in versions 1 and 2, we see this gap in front of Big Boss's face here with the cone of light shown in the background, almost as if something invisible is being highlighted by the lights and camera. Chico must have put at least his left arm out, as we see the medic do in the reenactment, as we also see Venom do in the final pause hallucination. Notice how the camera mostly blocks Venom's robotic prosthesis here, and we mostly see his right arm reaching out. If the camera is the box and mirror, and what is a camera but a box with mirrors, then it is indeed blocking vision of the lost limb as is done in real-life mirror therapy. Consider how Chico is blocked out by Medic. The reason we see Medic reaching out after Paz in place of Chico is because of our programming. Chico has been programmed to think that he is the Medic at this point in the game, so we literally see him there. Medic is a stand-in, a body double of Chico in Chico's own memory. If Kaz had just been pulled back by Medic, it stands to reason Medic would be behind Kaz, not beside Boss as he appears in the shot just before the explosion. And if you think about all the players who assume at the game's end that Venom is the Medic, well, this is an expected result of our Hollywood system of film language, which we know now is a system of control within this game. The game camera serves as our mirror, and it shows us this scene of Venom as the only one jumping after Paz as an illusion we're meant to superimpose upon the other scenes of the trauma, the explosion in Morpho, in order to find our way to some kind of answer that makes sense. In this way, the mirroring of Chico and Medic makes sense. They're both Big Boss after all. In fact, Medic was likely the one closer to the bench, having just pulled Kaz back, and Chico was probably closer to the door than we see him in the Ground Zeroes versions of these events, as he is when Morpho approaches the besieged MSF base. Medic is standing in for Chico in Chico's own memory because of trauma and because of programming. Now, this is the true purpose of showing the player the Paz illusions in the Phantom Pain. This is our cure, our mirror therapy, our final transformation into a butterfly. We have to imagine the hands swapped, so to speak, and then we can begin to feel like what it would be like, and then it should just click in our brains, and the pain should simply disappear. Chico has to remember he's Chico at some point, and he has to remember why he's doing what he's doing, and this realization has to happen in secret for the purposes of the cover operation. Now, this isn't your basic game of cups. Zero had a formidable enemy with Skullface. We know Zero probably didn't trust Skullface despite what we hear on the tapes. It'd be hard for me to imagine anyone as successful in spycraft as Zero also trusting someone like Skullface. XOF likely had their own black budget and autonomy from Zero, and that represents a problem to Zero, not to mention a mortal threat. His real plan was to have Venom sidle up to Skullface as an obvious fake, allow Skullface to mess around with the bait for a little bit before yanking the proverbial fishing rod and sending in Eli to snag control of Mantis from Skullface, pulling out the linchpin of Skullface's whole plan, as it were. As we know, Zero had been getting the Patriot system up and ready to be implemented, and indeed we should question whether the system is up and running or not by the time of the Ground Zeroes reenactment and of the Phantom Pains events. But before Zero could really get such a system running properly, XOF had to be dealt with and brought in under the umbrella the rest of the arms the Cypher's organization already were under. And, more than likely, there was also the consideration of Ocelot and Eva. Since they knew the real Big Boss, this whole plan to fool the world would require the two of them brought in as well. And given their loyalty to the man, something like Big Boss getting knocked into a coma is a perfect way to draw the two of them out from wherever they were operating and spur them to make contact with Zero. Skullface makes mention of the garden in one of the secret recordings of him torturing a prisoner. Now, given the presence of Adam and Eva in such close proximity following Ground Zeroes, this mention of the garden takes on kind of a biblical connotation, calling back to Metal Gear Solid 3's own kind of Genesis story. But here, it's not serving as a reference to Operation Virtuous Mission or Snake Eater. Those were 10 years ago. Why would Skullface be concerned with Snake Eater 10 years after the fact? Could this garden be a reference to another kind of Genesis? Another hidden layer beneath the surface? Perhaps this new Genesis is related to the burgeoning Patriots plan, and maybe 1975 was all part of the plan. Maybe Camp Omega was this Eden. One of Ground Zero's achievements is called Genesis, earned for completing just one of the side ops. It stands to reason Zero's plans could even go back to the aftermath of Snake Eater itself, and probably even further back than that. After all, Zero's been around since World War II and was key in planning Snake Eater. Now, here it seems like he has some sort of grand plan, like he's figured out the equation, he's proved the theory, and now he's implementing it with an automatic system that will compute the recurring permutations of the algorithm for him over time, as we see in the later Metal Gear games, pitting Snake against Boss again and again. And if 75 was when this plan was going into effect, then it stands to reason that Zero was setting all this up in Peace Walker. Before Peace Walker, Snake was still a mercenary and not under Zero's direct control as a reaction to both Snake Eater and Les Enfants Terribles. Snake had to be brought back in and needed to assume the mantle of Big Boss, which is indeed mostly what happens during the events of Peace Walker. Paz, as we know, was a programmed spy sent in by Cypher to aid in bringing Big Boss back into the fold, or perhaps disable his capabilities if he can't be brought in. Now, what about that plan requires meeting with Zero in Hell's Kitchen before she's sent off? It's as if Zero is giving her intel on this location before she's heading off for no good reason. Did he ever expect MSF to find her out and interrogate that intel from her? I doubt it. I think that intel was likely meant for Skullface the entire time, as he would likely be the one to pick up Paz after Peace Walker and then interrogate her for information. Therefore, it stands to reason Paz was instrumental in Zero's plan to consolidate everyone he didn't already have some control over. Big Boss, Skullface, Ocelot, and Eva all in one fell swoop. I think there was a fly in the ointment, however. I think Zero didn't expect Chico to go off on his own and rescue Paz. How could he predict something like Chico's unrequited crush on Paz? If Zero had planned on Paz's capture and torture happening, knowing how long she could hold out is something he could probably guess fairly accurately, considering he directly mentions to Paz that part of her training was literally to be tortured. But if Chico was added to that equation for days, I think it's fair to say that the torture she would be enduring would be worse than what she would endure otherwise. In addition to this, Chico gives up information about MSF's base to Skullface during his torture, and I don't think Zero predicted this at all. Consider the consequences of Chico's confession. Now, Skullface is able to secretly get his own men onto MSF's base, plant explosives, and probably is able to directly surveil Big Boss's chopper taking off to come to Camp Omega. Skullface is heard receiving this exact intel from a soldier during a recorded torture session. In fact, what if he was never supposed to have a spy on MSF's base, and because of Paz's and Chico's torture being worse than anticipated, Skullface got what he needed earlier than planned, and thus Big Boss arrived late, with his and Skullface's ships passing in the night? What if Zero had planned for Big Boss to infiltrate Camp Omega and find Skullface still torturing Paz? Imagine what likely would have happened. Skullface would have been immediately shot, Paz rescued, and then the bomb probably still would have gone off, but Chico wouldn't be in that chopper, and Skullface would be dead. There would be no need for Chico in that shell game, and Ocelot and Eva could still be brought in. I think if this all went the way I'm reckoning it, Zero probably felt badly about letting the whole Chico thing happen. After all, he was just a teenager caught up in a bigger game than he could have imagined. But he also needed another way of dealing with Skullface now. Maybe making Chico into Venom Snake wasn't just a punishment, and instead is part of his therapy, and also kind of an apology. I think Zero might have seen Chico's ill-fated rescue attempt as a sign of potential. Zero probably thought he could use Chico's loyalty towards providing cover for the real Big Boss while simultaneously taking out Skullface. But I also think Chico was only one part of this whole big shell game. The other part is, of course, Ishmael. The medic probably wasn't knocked into as bad of a coma as Chico, especially if he was, like I think, behind Big Boss in the chopper, and so it stands to reason this is why he's serving as the body double of the real McCoy. He was the first one of the two to wake up. That's why he's given the treatment the real Big Boss would get. Ocelot calls him John. He calls Ocelot Adam, but it's all just an act for Skullface and for the world. And then there's the issue of the voice change. Ask yourself this. Does Skullface know what the real Big Boss sounds like? Do you think he got any intel, any audio recordings with John's real voice on it any time in the past? Or do you think Zero kept all that from XOF and Skullface? What if the voice is changed because Skullface doesn't know what Big Boss sounds like? What if Skullface thinks Ishmael's voice is the voice of the real Big Boss? Does anyone that hasn't met the man really know what he sounds like? Ishmael stands in as a double of the real Big Boss during the Cyprus mission to preserve the illusion that the real Big Boss is still out there, hiding behind the decoy, Venom. But since no one sees anything past this decoy, we're left assuming the man behind the curtain is legit and not just another copy. Again, consider how we're led to believe Ishmael is the real Big Boss once we've completed the Phantom Pain for the first time. This also explains the kind of layering Chico and Medic have in memories. Chico is the mental double, and Medic is the physical double, both halves of the same singular cover. We're both Big Boss, as they say. The two were likely shipped to Cyprus together after the crash. Once Big Boss was stabilized and determined to be in a coma, he was probably secreted away on his own. Why would they ship anyone with Big Boss if this was an attempt on his life? Wouldn't they isolate him? They probably just wrapped the Medic's face with bandages before shipping him off in the open as bait, letting people assume that this was the real Big Boss, and then shipped Chico alongside him to be used in the whole plan. If they were both in Cyprus the whole time, though, there's a rub in the timeline. Ocelot leaves an intel tape for Ishmael stating that the two of them have been in a coma for 2 years, and Zero's basically off the radar now after his supposed poisoning. Ishmael tells Ahab then that he's been watching over him for 9 years. 11 years puts Venom's awakening at 1986, not 1984. This will make more sense later once I go into the other anachronisms found in the Phantom Pain, but keep in mind for now, we might not even know what year it really is as another part of our mental programming. Consider how the hallucination of Paz is herself stuck in 1974, and how this could be a hint towards Venom himself being stuck in 84. I have to stop and note here, if it really is 1986 when Chico comes to, that puts him at 24 years old, given he was 13 in 1975. 24, of course, is a famous television show starring Kiefer Sutherland, playing a character named Jack, but not Metal Gear's original Jack. Let's go back and revisit the compartmentalization aspect. If Chico is Venom, then maybe some of Chico's history has hints as to why he's left out of certain details of the operation. Chico did give up some intel even before Ground Zeroes back when he was captured during Peace Walker. He has a pattern of giving up information to enemies, and so it makes sense that he would need to be protected against this if he was to be made into an obvious decoy. By the same token, however, having a decoy who thinks it's the wrong year out there spouting false information for the enemy could be quite useful. But it doesn't do to have an obvious decoy operating completely off the radar. Cypher needed Venom to make some noise in Afghanistan and Africa in his search for Skullface, and also because this adds to the illusion that Big Boss is still out there operating and working for who knows who. I think this is why Venom's operation seems to be so oddly visible in many senses. Think of the speakers in the helicopter, the flashy appearance of his prosthetic arm, the evocative appearance of Quiet, and the game's own way of encouraging the player to go Rambo and just have a blast using all the different armaments and, well, toys that Cypher is giving us. In a very real way, we're Cypher's dog out here running into the thickets and brush of Afghanistan and Africa to flush out the real prey being hunted by the line of men with guns behind us in the distance. Venom's entire mission to find Skullface also serves as excellent training for the burgeoning Chico. I think Zero put everything into this program that Chico needed to become what Zero saw as the ideal soldier, one who was willing to put their ego aside and serve the mission instead of serving their own ideas. Remember the words of the boss, what will you choose, your loyalty to me or to your mission? I think Chico was never meant to fight Skullface exactly in the way the game plays out. Chico was meant to see Skullface dealt with as a kind of lesson in what happens when you go off chasing revenge. And Chico does still get the reward of seeing his tormentor ended right in front of him. He's even given the choice to shoot Skullface or not, and I think this choice makes sense. Chico doesn't really need to use the gun to get past all of his trauma. And besides, Miller, Huey, and the oil fire are going to take care of the rest of Skullface's body. Chico's loyalty to the mission is ultimately what brings him whatever closure he gets from Skullface's death, and I think Zero designed it this way on purpose. Recall how all the promotional material has been used against us. There is a particular statement Kojima made regarding a cut Skullface boss fight, which doesn't make much sense on the surface. Why mention a cut boss fight? What would it have consisted of? We never encounter Skullface in gameplay to fight him even once, so perhaps this mention of a cut boss fight is meant to parallel how Zero set up the ending, where Chico would never get a chance to actually fight Skullface. Eli was always meant to be the one who takes out Skullface. And speaking of Les Enfants Terribles, look at the name of the two twins, David and Eli. Zero's own name, David O, is given to the future Solid Snake. Liquid Snake, the egotistical one of the pair, is given a name opposite to David's name as a kind of warning, I think, from Zero to young David as to what happens if he stops serving his mission first. Zero's idea of the good soldier is consistent with what Dave grows up to become, and I think those same lessons are what he would have tried to teach Chico. From this perspective, then, it makes sense as to why Ground Zeroes is a virtual recreation of the Camp Omega mission. Think of what this means to Chico. He was captured here while trying to infiltrate it and endured maybe the most horrific thing of his entire life, certainly of his entire youth. Ground Zeroes represents a playground where Chico can go back, learn from his mistakes, and even learn quite a bit more beyond that. He's provided with a way of viewing his own trauma from an external perspective without divorcing that perspective from his own reality too much, since he's also now training to become Big Boss. It even stands to reason that Ishmael may have helped make this program work, maybe going into a prototype of it himself. There are hints all over Ground Zeroes that the entire mission is a recreation, but that really is a video all its own, and I believe there might even really be plenty out there right now to be found and read on the subject, so I won't go into it too much more here. And going back to this mention of cut material actually being a hint, let's take that logic towards other cut material and see what it gets us. Everyone loves to mention the cut adult Chico art, which depicts a man in a red cloak with a white peace symbol tilted to the right painted on the back of his cloak. Adult Chico is shown with a large meat hook in one hand, and the art also includes drawings of a brutal-looking machete, a cleaver, and an axe. Cutting weapons, really, and a big fish hook, like something you typically see with bait on it, attached to a fishing pole. I think it's obvious what this is. It's cut bait. There is also some cut text referring to a conversation with Amanda about Chico's whereabouts, and Amanda was apparently going to ask Snake to go deal with or otherwise contact Chico. What if none of this was ever really planned to happen? How would we know? What if all this was just another hint? Consider the placement of the peace symbol and compare it to the Never Be Game Over and Pig Boss on the back of Eli's jacket. There's also, of course, Chapter 3, the whole scenario with Eli. The Lord of the Flies situation with Sahelanthropus is shown in the cutscene released by Konami to be 30% complete. Well, what gives? Why say that? Why release any of this at all? Was it all just to sell us on the story that this game is incomplete? Just another cover story to keep us from searching out the real hidden truth of these games? What if Eli was working with Cypher the entire time? I mean, do we really know he went to that island? I believe the mentions of cut material from this game could also serve as a reference to material that was never meant to be part of the game in the first place, and instead is there because players expect it to be there in order for this whole trick to work. These cut materials are metatextual clues located outside the text itself, meant to provide hints as to the nature of the text's deception. The cut adult Chico art evokes the image of cut bait from a fishing line because it is. There's another thing to mention now that will bring us nicely into our next subject, and that's the Super Snake suit. In a concept art with the other Skulls and Mist units, this Super Snake suit is also shown, but allegedly never made it into the final game. Okay, why is it called a snake suit? Why not a Super Skull suit? I mean, this is another hint. Consider what these parasite suits are and do, and then think of the abilities Venom has in this game that seem to stand so far out of the normal tradition of Metal Gear. Venom has no health bar, he heals quickly on his own, and he only requires a single button press to stop and reset a dislocated joint or perhaps even a broken bone. We're left to assume this is just a case of the game using Call of Duty physics to justify damage mechanics in the name of having fun, but consider that this might be something that comes from the workings of the game's canon. What if Venom is wearing the Super Snake suit? Let's consider the parasites as a whole. These things are mysterious, y'all. There's a lot that I'm not even going to be able to answer about them, really. Their existence predates Metal Gear Solid 3, and it seems like there's some kind of secret weapon that's been shown to us without us realizing what they all really are. Of course, all of the Cobras from Metal Gear Solid 3 had the parasites in some form. Parasite therapy predates Operation Snake Eater, as Code Talker tells us in a tape that Skullface received his parasite therapy before even joining the Soviet Union as a spy after World War II. It is likely Skullface got his parasites in the mid to late 1940s, as Hungary's annexation of northern Transylvania happened in 1940, and his town was bombed in the war. So Cypher could have been working on parasites since well before 75 and 86. Zero tells Skullface over the phone that the parasites take multiple generations of breeding in order to produce useful results, and I think this is mostly true since Skullface would have had his own means of verifying. This could explain why Skullface has the skull suits at all. Cypher could have developed them first as a way to get to the Venom suit, with the female unit serving as a prototype for the eventual Quiet suit we see her in. In fact, Zero could have made a parasite copy of Code Talker as well, then took an incomplete stage of his parasite research and allowed Skullface to steal it, along with the prototype skull units. Skullface would then proceed in developing his own parasites along a path Zero had already been down, and could thus predict how long it would take for Skullface to get his results. The more advanced Super Snake suit, Venom, would then have no problem dealing with these prototypes, and indeed, a seasoned player can wipe the virtual floor with these bosses once you know what to expect. Venom has seemingly superhuman speed and stamina, and has no problem keeping that rate up even when carrying someone over his shoulder. We already know Quiet is wearing a parasite suit. Her speed, stealth camo, and other abilities come from this parasite suit that she has put on after the Cyprus Hospital incident. So we should really be asking ourselves, who else could be a potential suspect for a parasite suit wearing copy of a person? The Ground Zero's Snatchers reference might not have just been an idle reference. What if Zero already had this technology being worked on or even perfected in 75? In our investigation, we need to know what our positive criteria are for someone who's a parasite copy or a parasite therapy subject. There would be physical evidence, of course. We see Venom and Quiet shed these white dust particles throughout the game, especially when their abilities kick in. I believe these white dust particles in the air are the parasites. It makes sense that they'd need to regenerate and shed the old copies like human skin cells, and these white particles are likely that same kind of dandruff. So, who else has these dust particles around them? Well, obviously, Code Talker not only has this dust around him, he seems to be able to control the swarms of dust and even talk to them. When he tells Snake eyes on Kazuhira, it's right after he seemingly absorbs one of these swarms of parasite dust, which is acting like a scout for him, bringing him all kinds of intel from different parts of Mother Base. And Kaz has this dust around him as well. Parasites could explain Kaz's uncanny abilities. What if Kaz is a parasite copy that doesn't know what he is and is tortured in order to turn him into the person Venom rescues in that village as just another part of Venom's cover operation? After all, it won't do to have Big Boss building his legendary army without his trusty XO. I think we can pretty safely rule out a copy of Ocelot ever being made. I can't imagine he'd ever allow it. Ocelot's ability to make copies of himself lies in his own mental abilities via hypnosis and good old-fashioned duplicity. Huey is probably also himself as well, since we never see any parasite dust emitted from him, but the jury's kind of still out on that one too. And of course, Skullface is probably more parasite than human at this point, accounting for his entire look, but I doubt there are any copies he himself had the ability to make. I think only Zero really had the ability to make these advanced parasite suits, and if Skullface ever had the formula, he probably didn't have time to breed anything useful, as we can guess these suits have multiple prototype copies as a result of that multiple generation need for, as Zero calls it, anything useful. The parasites give us an answer as to how the Man on Fire works. Volgan's body is likely itself lifeless, but the parasites that almost certainly resided in his body are likely still alive in some sense. We don't see the white dust around him, only these floating red flakes, But he has a different parasite strain, one that gives him pyrokinetic powers unique to him. If the parasites are giving people powers, we should also consider Psycho Mantis. Ocelot tells us during the boy's education that he never showed any of his psychic powers we see him using. We're given an explanation that sounds shoddy at best. The boy was in a plane flying to Kiev, Ukraine, some thousands of miles north of Cyprus, around the time of Venom's awakening. Ocelot speculates that our own awakening to believing we are Big Boss made it all the way to Mantis due to him being due north from us. How this phenomenon actually works is not explained, although Ocelot elsewhere specifies Mantis's range is only 3 miles. I think if we consider it's 1986, and probably late March or April, we should consider what's going on in Ukraine. Of course, I refer to Chernobyl. Code Talker tells Skullface that radiation can be used as a way to halt the parasite's continued mating, freezing them in their generational tracks, as it were. If Treadage was given a parasite that enhanced his psychic powers, like say the one the Sorrow may have had, then his proximity to the Chernobyl nuclear reactor isn't just some coincidence. Treadage was likely weaponized by the Soviets by giving him a parasite lending him these psychic powers. Then he and his parasite were likely sterilized using Chernobyl's reactor, and the ensuing meltdown may have been either a cover-up or a later consequence of this action. One more person we should maybe consider as a parasite copy is the Paz rescued from Camp Omega. She has the dust around her as well. Remember, Chico tells Boss that he saw Paz die in front of him, although she perhaps could have been revived, but perhaps the Paz that was fished up by the fisherman was this copy, and the real ninth Paz died in Peace Walker. In any case, she's shown with some white dust in the air around her as Boss rescues her from her cell, which could definitely indicate that she's a copy. Perhaps Zero literally made multiple Paz Andrade Ortegas. The hallucination of Paz in the Phantom Pain does have one voice line indicating she knows she isn't the real Paz, implying Venom himself believes this to be the case. Think back to Zero's recorded conversation with Paz before Peace Walker we get in the truth tapes. He says that Paz is the ninth Paz Andrade Ortega, and the other 8 are in the next room taking it easy. Maybe they're dead, but I think that seems impractical. I don't think Zero was totally lying even though he was recording this. I think it's more likely he was telling a radical truth that he knew wouldn't be fully understood at the moment. Perhaps this was his way of letting the future boss know what really happened with Paz, and given how things played out, Chico also being let in on this makes sense. But note how he's already putting on the I'm an old sick man routine here in 74 or maybe even late 73 before Peace Walker even took place. But stop and think for a second. Where is this building? It's in New York on 10th Avenue. Paz says it took Zero 10 years to secure the place. Big Boss takes 10 days before going after Paz at Camp Omega. We know doing things in multiple recurring layers is kind of a theme for Zero. During V, there are 3 big bosses, John, Ishmael, and Ahab, 3 clone snakes, David, Eli, and George, Solidus, and 3 20-year spans from 1944, World War II, to 64, Snake Eater, to 84, the Phantom Pain's reference date, and so on and so forth. So, what if there are really 10 pauses? It stands to reason that if Zero was taking his pick of multiple copies, he'd want to compartmentalize each one, and there's no reason to let number 9 know about number 10's or any other copy's potential existence. Remember, Skullface knows Boss is coming and leaves early because of intel he got from Chico, not from Paz. Paz only gives up intel on Zero, setting up his apparent poisoning. Okay, so the stuff I'm going into here is pretty speculatory, I admit. I'm getting into guessing about all this stuff as more of a way of saying we should consider this all might be possible to expand our thinking about the plot of this game and indeed the other Metal Gear Solid games. There are hidden things all throughout every game, and although a lot of the quote-unquote official canon is out there on wikis and other fan sites to be read about, there's always the possibility we missed something. Well, now that we've gotten through the main bulk of what I wanted to get across, the whole Venom is Chico, Ishmael's the medic, Zero's playing a bigger game than we can see kind of thing, I think it's time to move on to looking at all the different things that are really on the table regarding the plot of this game and the franchise as a whole. So folks, get your tinfoil hats ready, take a drag from your phantom cigar, and come with me as I speculate wildly about some of the other things that might be going on here. Let's revisit the question of what year is it in The Phantom Pain and all of its implications and apparent issues. This is more speculation and doesn't really tie in with the main part of what I wanted to say already, so I've left it here in this extra section. But as in a Hideo Kojima game, you should know anything extra you can get, you should take. Stick around a bit longer and we'll see just how many cracks we can put in this egg. First of all, there are anachronisms in almost every Metal Gear Solid. The Calorie Mate featured in Metal Gear Solid 3, for example, didn't come out until 1983. Similarly in V, Peace Walker, Ground Zeroes, and The Phantom Pain, there is a Sony Walkman featured in each game that has not been invented in that game's alleged setting. In The Phantom Pain, the WM55 Walkman is featured, which was itself released in 1986. Could the anachronisms in these games also be hints like the cut material we analyzed earlier? A few anachronistic songs are featured in The Phantom Pain within the gameplay segments or cutscenes. Europe's The Final Countdown, recorded in late 1985 and released in late May 86, is found at Sakurai Village, and The Cure's Friday I'm in Love was recorded between 91 and 92 and released in May 1992. Friday I'm in Love can be found in a boombox inside Code Talker's mansion on Mission 28. It stands to reason, then, that this mission is taking place at least after May 1992. Additionally, although Midge Ure's cover of The Man Who Sold the World was recorded in the early 80s for use in the film Party Party, 1983, the song was not released by Midge until 1985's The Gift album, released funnily enough by a label named Chrysalis. Consider the game's abrupt ending and the mirror punching scene. What if that happens in 1995? 1984 is, I believe, used as kind of a reference point in the course of Chico's therapy and also as a kind of system of control for Cypher. After all, if Venom ends up captured and confessing to Skullface, if he believes it's 1984, that could throw an entire wrench in securing any useful intel from him. It makes sense that 1984 was already in the past when Venom woke up, as that reference point would have to have already been built into his hypnagogic programming. The biggest hint the game gives us that Venom is stuck in 1984 is, once again, with Paz. The hallucination of Paz gives Venom 5 tapes over the course of the 10 photos you can retrieve and return to Paz during the Phantom Pain by completing the Wandering Mother-based soldier side ops. In these tapes, Paz is aware she's stuck in a kind of time loop where the same day repeats again and again, leaving Peace Day always 3 days away. Peace Day never came. Ocelot's illusion tells us she won't respond to anything that conflicts with her internal timeline, which is stuck in 1974. Thus, Venom himself is the one stuck in this temporal loop, reliving the year 1984 over and over during the course of this game. So it's probably at least 1986 when V comes to, as I speculated earlier, due to the 2 years of both Ahab and Ishmael being in a coma after Ground Zeroes before the 9 years of watching and waiting, and probably programming. Think about how the game's plot ends so seemingly abruptly. What if the looming Outer Heaven incident we know of was on the horizon? Chico's training was complete, and he was now taking on his real mission, his final mission as it were. How much time do we think passes between the last missions in the game and the mirror scene? Was it really any time at all? Consider that from 1986 to 1995 is exactly 9 years as well. What if we, the players, lost those 9 years while playing the game since we thought it was 84 the whole time? But you're saying, what about Eli? He was born in 72. How can he look like a kid if it's the 90s? Shouldn't he look more grown up? Well, once more, think of Paz. She was in her 20s in Peace Walker, and everyone thought she was a 16-year-old schoolgirl. She was, as we know, tailor-made by Zero, just like Eli. What if Eli also has slowed aging? Consider that David, Eli's brother, is given an advanced aging gene. What if Eli was given the opposite to that? Would we really be able to tell if we don't know what year it is in the Phantom Pain when we pick him up? Would we be able to tell during Shadow Moses? Doesn't he already kind of look young for his age at Shadow Moses? Would David's own advanced aging already have separated his looks from Liquid's enough at that point? I think it's hard to say, but it's definitely worth considering. There's also the issue of Eli's behavior. What if he was picked up around the early 90s, say 1991, and he was 19 but looked still, say, 13. Consider Chico was 13 when he got into all of this stuff, and what seeing this 13-year-old with an army of children would mean to Chico. Imagine how an egomaniac would feel as a 19-year-old trapped in the body of someone apparently much younger. I think the way Eli acts fits that profile pretty well, at least on paper, and it adds to the story's already present themes. And if Eli was meant to be the secret weapon to take out Skullface by seizing control of Mantis, think of how well this de-aging would work for cover. Skullface would never expect this blonde-haired, British-accented head of a child army in Africa to be one of the clones of the real big boss, especially if it really is the early 90s when he gets there. Consider that everyone's suspicion of Eli might simply be for the sake of Venom, who would think it's 84, and thus Eli's appearance would ironically match Venom's internal timeline, begging a need to prove Eli isn't the son of Big Boss, which of course they do using a DNA test, which confirms what we and all Diamond Dogs already know, that Venom isn't Eli's father. Moving on, or I guess really in this case back, let's talk about Peace Walker's 2 endings. Remember the first ending of the game that shows the mammal pod walking into the water while singing to defuse the whole international incident? Well, Snake takes his bandana off in this sequence and lets it go during that whole ending. Then, after the credits roll, there's a post-credits scene, as is tradition with every Metal Gear Solid. In this one, Snake tells Miller he felt like the boss betrayed him by putting down her gun in the end, which is a line standing in stark contrast to what we just saw as he took off his bandana. What if this post-credits scene is an alternate version of the scene we just watched, where he doesn't take the bandana off? Indeed, if you continue to play the game and go on to develop Metal Gear Zeke and eventually reach the game's secret ending after recapturing Zadornov all those times, during all this stuff happening, Big Boss has his bandana on. He seems to never take it off in this version of events. It's up to the player to determine if we get the quote-unquote good ending of Peace Walker or not. We have to understand the will of the boss. We have to put down the gun, in this case the game itself. However, given the prevalence of the line Peace Day never came, in Ground Zeroes and V as a whole, we can assume this bandana timeline where Zeke is developed is the one we're playing. The no bandana timeline might end a whole different way, or might lead into Ground Zeroes in a different way, or it might just not have any eventuality for now. Maybe Big Boss decides to start working with Cypher, or quit the struggle completely and go some other way. It stands to reason that the Pacifica Ocean incident wouldn't ever happen if Boss never developed Zeke, so it's hard to say what's up with this no bandana ending. In any case, this is a whole topic to look into for another video. However, if we do assume Big Boss never takes off the bandana, then the fact that in Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain we never have the bandana to start, and instead have to develop it and equip it, might be a hint towards the reconstructed and false nature of these big bosses we're playing as. Perhaps in the real version of Ground Zeroes, Big Boss was wearing his bandana, so in the reconstruction he has it off. For one last rub in all of this, the descriptive text of the bandana in the Phantom Pain specifies that it was retrieved from the waters of the Caribbean, implying that the ending where Boss takes off his bandana does indeed precede the Phantom Pain. It almost seems like both timelines are here superimposed upon one another, just like the Morpho scene. We really shouldn't be too surprised by visual stories that straight up lie to us through the visuals and the format itself. Plenty of movies do this with their entire story. I mean, just go watch Fight Club or Memento for a couple of good examples. The Usual Suspects even does this in its own way by framing what we see on the screen as the story, lies included, as told by another character within that film's story. Setting a story in a story is a long tradition in storytelling, and that kind of meta-level storytelling is maybe not as common nowadays, but we should indeed always be wary of a narrator in a story that's lying to their audience within that story, and thus lying to us. Most Hollywood films try to explain everything to their audience, but plenty of examples do exist where the viewer's own interpretation is sort of left to do the job of filling in the gaps left by a movie. Just go watch a David Lynch film. In Metal Gear Solid V, we're supposed to do the same thing, but even that fact is hidden from us. There are two twists. One obvious one we're supposed to get easily, and a second one hidden somewhere we'd never think to look. Another thing I want to mention briefly is the character of Skullface. A few people question this guy's true identity, some speculating that he could be the real Big Boss, or that maybe he's someone else we've seen before without realizing it. Personally, I think Skullface is exactly who he appears to be, and there's a reference to explain why that is. Skullface is technically Hungarian, but he's originally Transylvanian. In 1940, his part of Transylvania was annexed by Hungary, probably radicalizing him. We know his village was bombed while it was hiding a munitions factory during World War II, and that Skullface himself was burned badly during this conflict by burning oil getting on his face, causing him to need the parasites to survive. Absolutely Lynchian. Skullface's origins are fire and parasites, and his end is this same kind of oil fire with more parasites. Once he's crushed by Sahelanthropus and shot, there's an oil fire burning all around him, and eventually Kotalker has his body cremated. There's a nice roundness to that beginning and end. And there's also another reference to sort of verify this for us. Omega is the name of the camp we first see Skullface at, and Omega is also the name of a famous Hungarian band, perhaps the most famous Hungarian band. Omega started in the early 60s as a prog rock outfit. They mostly sing in Hungarian, sometimes releasing English versions of their songs as well. At some point in the 70s, Communist Hungary banned many of Omega's past albums, forcing the band to relocate temporarily and kind of lose their home country. The parallels to Skullface's past should be self-evident. I don't believe Skullface is anyone other than who he appears to be, Zero's old XO driven mad by revenge. Skullface himself kind of represents the shadow of the series as a whole to this point in its chronology, in both the real and a metaphorical sense. Zero probably couldn't have accomplished what he has to this point without utilizing the brutality Skullface provides as operations. But I also think there was no place for Skullface in the future of the Patriots. Hungary and the former Transylvania itself have suffered a lot as a result of World War II, and so in this way I think it's appropriate to have Skullface stand as a kind of parallel to all that within the series. There are some other oddities I haven't touched on yet. The technology is all crazy. There are wormholes, the iDroid is a whole thing, there are weapons that seem like they're appropriate for the era but don't match much of anything in our reality. Venom's arm seems like it shouldn't be possible to be made in the 80s, as we're only just today getting good robotic prosthetic technology ourselves. The out-of-context technology in this game is wild, but that's really nothing new for this series. Indeed, if you consider that Venom is working directly for Cypher, perhaps that's where all this fancy technology is coming from. Layer that truth with the idea that Venom won't respond to anything from after 84, and perhaps we see then that there was a need to 1984-ize newer weapons technologies for his use. But that's just one example. Every Metal Gear game has some example of technology that quote-unquote shouldn't exist in that era. Everyone also knows that the military develops technology years, perhaps even decades ahead of what's available in the civilian marketplace. Well, I've got a whole theory that kind of pulls together all these things, but it's a doozy. Before I get into it though, let me state that this whole theory didn't just come about as a way of trying to figure out how all this crazy technology exists. Allow me to explain. The parasite suits are problematic. I do think Venom is wearing a parasite suit, but how did Skullface and or Cypher get a parasite developed for Quiet and everyone else like they did in the time they had? Did Zero know Quiet was going to be used as the assassin at Cyprus? Was Skullface even running the operation at Cyprus? Could Zero have leaked the parasite research in the prototype suits to Skullface and made Quiet's himself? If Skullface made the parasite suit Quiet has, why not make others, and why continue to use the prototype skull suits? I mean, did he just lack the time? Consider this. If Skullface really was politically exiled in Africa after the Guantanamo incident in 75 until his death, could he have staged the XOF attack we see in Dhekelia? Dhekelia itself is much like Guantanamo, an area of Cyprus under UK sovereignty. It seems unlikely to me that Skullface could have managed this attack we see in the intro of The Phantom Pain. If Skullface was running it, where are his signature units, the skulls? We never see Trettage wearing the telltale Skullface mask he has over his eyes while he's parasitizing Skullface later in the game. And if Skullface wasn't there at Dhekelia, well, that means Psycho Mantis, the squads of soldiers, and indeed Quiet herself are all probably part of a Cypher plan, not XOF. Consider this also means that the third child was probably brought to Africa for the explicit purpose of falling under Skullface's control. The introduction of Psycho Mantis could have been a play by the Soviet philosophers against Zero. But even then, Zero's plan to use Eli to seize control of Mantis would still work, and even from that perspective makes sense as a counter-move to Treachage's introduction to the game. I don't know if Skullface had time to develop the quiet suit from the prototypes he had. If he had time to do that, why not make other more powerful suits as well? Maybe that's why Chico was in his coma for 11 years, to give Zero enough time to develop the suits for both him and Quiet. Consider how closely her burning resembles what we know about Skullface's burning. Could she have been set up to play this part by Zero as well, to serve as kind of a positive version of not chasing revenge against Skullface's negative example? Zero says on the phone to Skullface before his poisoning that the parasites were simply a useful test case for reverse evolution and nothing more. He mentions how they take multiple generations to produce any kind of usable result, and he probably wasn't lying there. Skullface would likely have his own facilities and scientists and access to research in order to confirm all this himself. But what if Zero had a way to breed these multiple generations in a shorter time span that anyone knew was possible? What if Zero had made his plan in such a way so that he would have everything he needed to carry it out by 1986? Could he have had the entire plan ready to go by even 75 or before then? Also, what if 11 years still wasn't long enough? What if Zero needed more time? What would it really take to get his plan ready? And what's all this business about reverse evolution? Why were they reversing the parasite's evolution? Perhaps the reversing of the evolution of the parasites is how they were able to tame and then weaponize them for their own customized purposes, but that doesn't necessarily explain why there was a need to de-evolve them. Well, let's put a pin in this for a second. We need to talk about Metal Gear Survive. I know it's not technically a part of V, but guess what? There's a V in the title. There's two, in fact, and one of them on the cover is indeed larger and covered in this dread dust. And the origins of the game's core idea and story are dubious beyond the credited writers in the game, who are great, by the way. In Survive, the dread dust is said to be evolved medical nanomachines that have run amok and consumed and covered the Earth in the 22nd century. The nanomachines operate via a hive mind and can incorporate the properties of any type of matter into their structure. This timeline is the eventuality of the Metal Gear Solid universe, according to Survive. A group existed in 1975 called Wardenclyffe, and its existence goes back to at least 1943 to the Philadelphia experiment, which you should look up because it's cool. But this Wardenclyffe organization has this wormhole digger, which they use to open up a portal to Dite, the game's setting. Dite is a reference to the city in hell described in Dante's Divine Comedy. In the beginning of the game, we're told this place is an alternate dimension, but that was just a cover story to hide the real truth. We're in our own future. Wardenclyffe has a time machine at their disposal, and they're using it to stage an expedition into this future apocalyptic landscape to establish bases. And it's not even clear if the section is fully aware of all these details. In this game, we also meet the AI pod that we see in V and Peace Walker housing the boss's personality. Here, though, it's named Virgil, and it has a different personality altogether. One of the researcher's audio logs you can unlock and Survive mentions how Virgil's personality had many reference points used in its making. Now, who do we think had the authority to do this? Now, this wormhole technology is also present in V. It's not strictly used in the main story anywhere, but you can develop a wormhole Fulton device. Cypher must have had access to wormhole technology, probably back in the mid-70s at least. We have no idea where the wormhole digger came from, but it looks exotic, futuristic, and also somehow kind of like an artifact. And Wardenclyffe doesn't just have one, they have two. There's one at Wardenclyffe used to send the captain, Survive's protagonist, to Dite, and another one is found there in the future and used to send one character, Chris, back to the past. Although he ends up in 1943, earlier than his home time, which was sometime in the 80s. Now, Chris himself ends up getting picked up by Wardenclyffe in 1943, and going by the name Good Luck, rises in the organization and is himself a central part of the time loop happening in that game's plot. When Chris is sent back, another character gives him an iDroid. Now think about this for a second. An iDroid from sometime in the 2100s goes back to 1943, and then that scientist keeps it secret and uses the things he sees on the iDroid to prop up his own career within Wardenclyffe and indeed in Cypher itself. This could be where all the future tech is coming from. It's technically an Ouroboros. Huh? And consider what all Zero's got here all at once. He's got a time travel device, and he can open doors into the future, send expeditions there, set up bases, and conduct his own experiments over long periods of time, and then send back the results to mere seconds after he sent it all away, or perhaps even right before he sent it away as a kind of confirmation of success. I mean, Zero's got a hyperbaric time chamber. He could breathe entire swaths of parasite generations in no time flat. Skullface would have no idea Wardenclyffe even exists, but I bet Cypher was hooked right into its operations. Perhaps this is another layer of the garden that Skullface referred to. And indeed, if Zero could carve out his own territory in Dite, he could build a veritable Eden, making himself a kind of creator god in the process. Perhaps he renamed the AI pod Virgil as he intended to take it with him as a guide to his Dante through this future hell into his own vision of Paradiso. Speaking of evolution, what about the Dread Dust and the nanomachines? Remember, Zero mentioned the parasites were a useful case for de-evolution, and then I speculated that they perhaps de-evolved the parasites to weaponize them? Well, what do you think would happen to the Dread Dust over time if it continued to evolve? Could it have turned into something like these parasites, adapted to infest and live within living organisms instead of simply replacing them? How different are parasites from nanomachines? In many ways, they are literally Metal Gear Solid V's
nanomachines, son.
What if the evolved form of these nanomachines were the parasites that had lived in the far future, then were brought back to the past after being de-evolved out of their hive mind? What if Zero made the nanomachines and the parasites here in Dite in the future the whole time? Or maybe he showed up here the first time and discovered them already existing as an inevitable outcome. And let's be honest, Code Talker tells us these parasites predate language itself. Given what we see the Lord of Dust capable of, opening portals further to the past of humanity doesn't seem like much of a stretch from there for a more evolved version of this same life form. What if all this technology always came from the future, and Zero is playing a game to keep as much of it contained as possible while also using it in his fight? Or perhaps Zero himself is the source of the loop. We can't know, as the origins of the time travel machine, the dust, the parasites, and the nanomachines are dubious at best. It is important to note, however, that in the plot of Survive, the Dread Dust steals the wormhole technology from the Virgil AI pod, presumably meaning the dust did not have the ability to create these wormholes to begin with until this point, which has troubling implications for the nature of the time loop. Another thing to consider is the origin of all of these ideas in terms of the making of these games. We know the story of V was more or less figured out by 2011, and given what all we've talked about here, it would have to have been at least partly figured out during the making of Peace Walker, putting really the origin of some of these ideas back as far as 2009 possibly. There is a concept art of a wanderer from Survive done by Masahiro Ito that has a date next to it, but in every released version of this art, the date is obfuscated. We ultimately don't know when this was drawn, but it stands to reason they'd want to obfuscate it because it was earlier than anyone guessed, not because it was later. I mean, what if this was drawn as early as 2012 or even 2011? Could Kojima have taken part in planning all this story we see in Survive, then left his name off of it due to leaving the company in 2015 before Survive was made? Again, just consider that this is more of a way to open your mind to other possibilities and to hopefully do your own research and to see if you can figure out something everyone else has missed so far. Back in the 80s, Konami had a kind of unofficial mascot, the MOAI statue. I first encountered the terrifying MOAI heads in the Gradius games, and indeed the MOAI are also in the Metal Gear series in various places. I like to think of this theory of Zero having access to a time travel device, the MOAI theory, the mother of all inventions, or integrations, or intrigues, or insanity? I don't know. Take your pick. I think it's a good acronym, though. But step back for a second again and consider what I've described Zero doing here. He's sending stuff through a wormhole, having it developed in the future, then sent back to him mere seconds later, if not in that instant. He could set up an entire facility with advanced computers there on the other side of these wormholes and do massive amounts of computing in literally no time via wireless communications between that facility in the future and his own computers here in the past. There's a game out there by Kojima that uses this exact system, in fact. It's Death Stranding. The chiral network works by sending data to the beach, processing it there, and then sending it back to just before it leaves. This is also how the printing of structures works in that game. The object structure is assembled on the beach and then transferred to the moment you sent off the materials. Zero has invented a prototype of the chiral network. I don't think it's a coincidence that all these details from Death Stranding, the wormholes, time travel, and other dimension that might actually just be our own far-off future, are all over Metal Gear Solid V's plot, lurking in the background. These things we see and survive potentially explain a lot of the how did this get pulled off questions we have for V as a whole. And going even further, we know the Metal Gear timeline has events going to at least 2014, even further depending on if you want to include Revengeance. Death Stranding itself most likely takes place in that game's 2048, with a history going back to around 2016 as best as we can guess. And Survive's D-Day is said to be sometime in the 2100s. So, all these timelines fit together. The technology is consistent, even the mythologies of the games are mostly consistent. Compare Cliff to the Sorrow. Die Hard Man's name is straight out of a Metal Gear game. Death Stranding's camera seems very similar to Metal Gear Solid V's. Yes, these are separate games made by separate people at different companies at different times, but we have to remember they all do share a common thread: Hideo Kojima. Death Stranding could be a secret Metal Gear sequel. Again, that's a subject for a whole other video, or maybe a bunch of videos. That stuff all goes beyond the scope of what I wanted to cover here, but I wanted to mention it because V is so tied up in all of these things. I think it's really worth our while to consider as much as we can about what Kojima's really getting at with his last few games. And I also just want to say again that this is all just my one interpretation, but I didn't come up with all of this on my own. The Metal Gear fan community has a lot of great people that I've met and talked with over the years, and I wouldn't have made any of this without all of those interactions. In particular, I want to thank Italian Joe, Doug Green, and Alice for helping me with figuring out some answers to some key things in this whole whopper of a theory. I also want to say thank you to Film Cred and Anna for helping me edit this essay and get all of the grammar and everything a little bit more clear. I hope you've at least enjoyed this video if you stuck through it this far. If you have anything you want to add or suggest or possibly correct, or if you want to provide your own interpretation of things, the comment section is always open. I can't promise I'll be able to respond to everyone, but I'll do my best to at least read them all. Shine on, you crazy diamonds. Peace.